They were never supposed to become enemies. In fact, for one brief, dazzling moment, they were sold to the world as the future of the British monarchy. William and Catherine, Harry and Meghan. Two brothers and two women who seemed ready to carry an ancient institution into a new century. The photographs looked perfect. 4 young royals walking side by side. 4 smiles. 4 carefully chosen outfits. 4 people who, according to the headlines, were about to modernize the crown before lunch and still make it home in time for tea. The British press called them the Fab Four. It was a nickname with a great deal of optimism packed into 2 small words. The original Fab Four had guitars, matching suits, and eventually some fairly serious disagreements of their own. In hindsight, perhaps the comparison was more accurate than anyone realized. Within 2 years, Harry and Meghan would step away from royal duties. They would leave Britain, move across the Atlantic, and begin telling their version of what had happened behind palace doors. William and Catherine would remain at the center of the monarchy, taking on greater responsibility and representing continuity. The brothers who had once appeared inseparable would be described as distant, and Catherine and Meghan would become the public faces of a feud that was much larger than either woman. So what actually broke? Was it a bridesmaid's dress? A misunderstood comment? A disagreement about etiquette? Was it the British tabloids, the palace machinery, 2 brothers carrying old wounds, or 2 couples imagining completely different futures? The most honest answer is that no single moment explains it. Families rarely collapse like a chandelier hitting the floor. More often, the screws loosen one by one. A conversation goes badly. An apology does not quite land. Someone feels unprotected. Someone else feels accused. The same event is remembered in 2 incompatible ways. Then, one day, everybody looks up and asks why the room is suddenly dark. This is not a story about choosing Team Kate or Team Meghan, as though the monarchy were a football derby and we all needed scarves. It is not even mainly a story about 2 women who failed to become friends. They were never under any obligation to become best friends. Most sisters-in-law are not expected to launch a charitable foundation together, share staff, coordinate wardrobes, charm the Commonwealth, and look delighted while doing it, in high heels on wet cobblestones. This is the story of 2 very different women entering the same family by 2 very different roads. One learned to survive the system by moving carefully within it. The other arrived with an identity already built and expected to use her voice. One came to represent continuity. The other came to represent change. Between them stood husbands, courtiers, advisors, newspapers, history, hierarchy, and a national obsession with decoding facial expressions from photographs taken at 30 frames per second. In Britain, it is possible to spend an entire afternoon discussing whether someone said "fine" in a warm way or in a way that requires 3 follow-up meetings and a cup of tea. At a palace, a global media industry, and several centuries of protocol, and "fine" can become a constitutional weather system. To understand why Catherine seemed such a natural fit for royal life, we have to go back to the years before Meghan arrived. Catherine Middleton met Prince William while they were students at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Their relationship unfolded over years, not months. She had time to observe the institution from the edge before stepping into its center. That did not make the experience easy. It gave her something closer to an extended apprenticeship, although most apprentices do not have photographers waiting outside nightclubs or newspaper columnists grading their family background. The press could be cruel. Catherine was followed, scrutinized, and mocked. Her mother had once worked as a flight attendant, a perfectly respectable job that somehow became a class joke in parts of the British media. Catherine herself was given nicknames, suggesting she was waiting too patiently for a proposal. Every outfit, holiday, expression, and family decision became public property. But time gave her room to learn the strange grammar of royal life. She learned that the institution speaks most loudly when it says almost nothing. She learned that a public appearance is not simply an appearance. It is a message about continuity, geography, patronage, diplomacy, and sometimes the national importance of opening a community leisure center in Drizzle. She also learned the central rule of the royal household. The individual is temporary, but the role is meant to endure. When Catherine married William at Westminster Abbey in April 2011, she was entering a future that had been discussed for years. William was second in line to the throne at the time. The broad shape of their lives was not a mystery. There would be public duties, military ceremonies, official tours, charitable causes, relentless attention, and an expectation of calm. Catherine's public style developed slowly. She rarely made dramatic declarations. She did not attempt to reinvent the monarchy in her first 100 days, perhaps because monarchies do not have first 100 days. They have first 100 years, and then a committee reviews the curtains. Her strength was consistency. She showed up. She listened. She learned names and routines. She chose causes, especially early childhood development and mental health, that could be built over time. Her public image became one of steadiness, familiar silhouettes, controlled messages, little visible appetite for controversy. To admirers, this was discipline and dignity. To critics, it could look cautious or overly managed. Both readings may contain part of the truth. The same silence that looks graceful to one person can look distant to another. The same respect for hierarchy that looks sensible inside a palace can look cold to someone arriving from outside it. For William, Catherine represented more than a wife and partner. She represented stability after a child had lived under extraordinary pressure. His parents' marriage had broken down in public. His mother's life and death had been consumed by media attention. Catherine's family, by contrast, offered a private domestic world that reportedly became important to him. Ordinary meals, close relationships, a kitchen where not every conversation was followed by a communique. By the time Meghan entered the picture, Catherine had spent well over a decade learning when to speak, when to wait, whom to call, and how a tiny decision could ricochet through several royal households. She had earned trust the palace way, gradually, quietly, and with enough patience to make a British queue look spontaneous. Then Meghan arrived. She did not arrive as a blank page. She was in her 30s, divorced, American, biracial, and professionally established. She had worked as an actress, most visibly on the television drama Suits, and had built a public identity around travel, lifestyle, charity, and women's advocacy. She knew cameras, interviews, production schedules, and the modern language of personal storytelling. That background made her exciting. It also meant she approached public life with instincts shaped by a very different culture. In American celebrity culture, speaking directly can create trust. You explain your motives. You tell your story. You turn personal experience into a connection with the audience. In royal culture, explanation can create danger. Every sentence becomes a precedent, a headline, or a question about why another member of the family has not said the same thing. Hollywood says, "Find your light." The palace says, "Please stand on this small piece of tape and do not block the future king." Neither approach is automatically virtuous. Both are systems with their own rules. But if you mistake one for the other, trouble arrives, wearing a morning coat. Harry and Meghan's relationship moved quickly. They were introduced in 2016, and their engagement was announced in November 2017. For Harry, The speed may have felt like certainty. He had grown up in an institution where nearly every choice was examined, briefed, leaked, and debated. A relationship that felt immediate and emotionally clear may have offered relief from all that hesitation. For William, according to accounts later described by Harry, caution about the pace was received not as brotherly concern, but as doubt about Meghan herself. Here we reach one of the patterns that would define the years ahead. The same act carrying two meanings. One brother may have believed he was saying, "Slow down, I want to protect you." The other may have heard, "I do not trust the woman you love." In an ordinary family, that might produce a frosty Sunday roast. In this family, it became part of a historic rupture. Meghan also entered royal life under an intensity that was particular to her. Some coverage was standard royal intrusion: clothing, family, money, manners, supposed ambition. Some of it carried unmistakable racial and cultural undertones. Headlines and commentary treated her background as exotic, suspicious, or socially disruptive in ways that cannot simply be dismissed as the normal price of fame. The palace did issue an unusual public statement in 2016, condemning the abuse and harassment directed at her. But the larger question was not only whether the institution recognized the problem, it was whether it could protect her in the way she and Harry believed it should. That difference matters. An old institution may believe protection means silence, private legal advice, controlled access, and waiting for a story to die. A person under attack may believe protection means a direct public defense. Say this is false, say this is wrong, say her name. When those definitions do not match, silence stops feeling neutral. It feels like abandonment. At first, however, the public story was full of possibility. Meghan brought charisma, confidence, and a global following. She spoke with the fluent energy of someone accustomed to making a case. At the Royal Foundation Forum in February 2018, she sat beside Harry, William, and Catherine and spoke about women's empowerment and the importance of listening to women who already had voices. It was a revealing moment. She was not merely promising to learn. She was signaling that she wanted to work, advocate, and begin quickly. In the language of startups, she was ready to scale. The monarchy, meanwhile, was still locating the correct embossed folder. The contrast with Catherine was easy to see, and much too easy to weaponize. Catherine had been rewarded for patience. Meghan was praised for urgency. Catherine's supporters saw professionalism in restraint. Meghan's supporters saw authenticity in openness. Soon, every quality admired in one woman would be used as evidence against the other. If Catherine was calm, Meghan was demanding. If Meghan was confident, Catherine was dull. If Catherine followed protocol, Meghan was refreshing. If Meghan questioned protocol, Catherine was loyal. Two women became opposing columns in a culture war spreadsheet neither of them had created. And because comparison is the cheapest fuel in the media business, it burned beautifully. There is a particularly old trick in stories about famous women. Pretend there is only one chair. One must be prettier, kinder, more stylish, more maternal, more authentic, more royal. Cooperation is possible, but rivalry is profitable. A photograph of two women smiling may earn a modest headline. A photograph in which one appears to be looking half an inch to the left can finance an entire weekend of commentary. Yet the deeper problem was not that Catherine and Meghan were different. Families absorb differences all the time. The problem was that their differences mapped onto a hierarchy. Catherine was married to the future king. Her household's long-term role was central and non-negotiable. Meghan was married to the younger brother, a hugely popular figure, but one whose formal position would move farther from the center as William's children grew older. This is the quiet mathematics of monarchy. Love may be equal in a family. Rank is not. At public events, that hierarchy determines order, precedence, access, staffing, funding, and whose long-term program takes priority. It is not a misunderstanding that can be solved by everyone agreeing to be nicer. It is the architecture of the institution. For someone raised inside it, the hierarchy can feel like weather, ever present, occasionally unpleasant, but not a personal insult. For someone entering as an adult, especially someone accustomed to being evaluated on performance and initiative, it can feel intensely personal. Why should a good idea wait? Why should popularity not translate into influence? Why should one household's plans automatically come first? The palace answer would be simple, because that is how succession works. The modern answer would be equally simple. Perhaps that is the problem. Neither answer leaves much room for a relaxed family WhatsApp group. The image of the Fab Four briefly concealed this tension. At Christmas in 2017, the two couples appeared together at Sandringham. In February 2018 came the Royal Foundation Forum. The branding seemed irresistible. William, the future king. Catherine, the steady partner. Harry, the charismatic veteran. Meghan, the modern campaigner. Different strengths, one mission. When Harry joked at the forum that the four of them were stuck together, the audience laughed. At the time, it sounded affectionate. Later, it would be replayed like a line of foreshadowing in a prestige drama. Publicly, the four spoke about mental health, young people, conservation, women's rights, and charitable action. They looked like a generational answer to the monarchy's biggest question. How does an old institution remain useful in a changing society? But the picture encouraged an expectation that was probably impossible from the beginning. 4 adults, 2 marriages, 2 households, unequal positions, different working styles, and an enormous staff ecosystem were expected to function as one cheerful unit. The public saw a band. The palace saw an organizational chart. Even genuine warmth could not remove the structural problem. William and Harry were not building parallel futures. William's future was prescribed. Harry's was flexible but secondary. Catherine's role would expand with William's. Meghan's role had to be negotiated around a system designed long before she arrived. And that negotiation was happening during the most emotionally intense period imaginable. A royal engagement, a major wedding, a pregnancy in the wider family, global press attention, new staff, new rules, and personal family crises. Meghan's father became the center of a painful media story shortly before the wedding. Questions about whether he would attend, staged photographs, private messages, and family interviews created chaos at exactly the moment when every detail was supposed to be controlled. Whatever tension existed inside the royal family, Meghan was also dealing with heartbreak and public embarrassment in her own. Catherine, meanwhile, had given birth to Prince Louis less than a month before Harry and Meghan's wedding. She was caring for a newborn while preparing herself and her children for an event watched by millions. This detail does not prove anyone's version of a later disagreement, but it matters. Context is not a verdict. It is simply the difference between treating people as characters and treating them as human beings. On the 19th of May 2018, the wedding itself offered a spectacular vision of change and tradition, sharing the same chapel. There was an American preacher, a gospel choir, famous guests, military uniforms, British pageantry, and the particular expression worn by royal relatives when a sermon becomes more energetic than the order of service had perhaps suggested. Millions watched Harry and Meghan leave St. George's Chapel in an open carriage. For a few hours, the story felt complete. The prince had found happiness, the monarchy had opened its doors, and Britain had produced excellent weather on command, which may have been the least believable part of the entire day. But behind the celebration, small conflicts had already begun to acquire larger meanings. And soon, one of those conflicts would become the most famous dress fitting in modern history. The basic facts are simple. Princess Charlotte and several other young girls were bridesmaids at Harry and Meghan's wedding. In the days before the ceremony, there was concern about the fit of Charlotte's dress. A disagreement followed between Catherine and Meghan. After that, simplicity packed a bag and left the country. Months after the wedding, newspaper reports claimed that Meghan had made Catherine cry during a bridesmaid dress fitting. The story became one of the first great pieces of evidence in the emerging case against Meghan. Here, readers were told, was proof that the newcomer had upset the composed and dutiful Duchess. In the 2021 interview with Oprah Winfrey, Meghan gave the opposite account. She said Catherine had upset her and that she, Meghan, had cried. She also said Catherine later apologized and brought flowers. Meghan's point was not simply that the original story had the wrong woman in tears. It was that the palace had not publicly corrected a damaging narrative. Harry later offered more detail from his perspective in his memoir, Spare, including an account of text messages about the fit of Charlotte's dress. But Catherine has not publicly given her own full version, and the private exchange has been reconstructed through claims, recollections, and reporting. That leaves us with an important boundary. We know there was a disagreement. We know its public meaning grew far beyond the practical problem of a child's dress. We do not have a neutral recording of every conversation, and we should not pretend that we do. The details have been disputed for years. That sentence may be less thrilling than exclusive truth revealed, but it has the useful quality of being honest. It is also worth asking why the story mattered so much. Adults disagree before weddings every day. Florists receive messages that would make a hostage negotiator request a quiet room. Families argue about seating charts, dietary requirements, children, photographs, and whether Uncle David can be trusted with a microphone. Usually, the monarchy survives. This disagreement became famous because it offered one clean, visual scene for a conflict that was complicated and mostly invisible. Two duchesses, one small dress, tears, an apology. It was practically designed for a headline. But the real issue was not fabric. It was trust. From Meghan's perspective, a false or inverted story had been allowed to shape the public's view of her. If Catherine knew what had happened, and the institution knew what had happened, why did no one correct it? From the palace perspective, publicly denying every story could create an endless cycle. Correct one detail, and reporters ask why you have not corrected 10 others. Confirm a private disagreement, and you give it official life. The traditional strategy is to avoid comment, deny very selectively, and hope the news cycle moves on. Unfortunately, the news cycle had found a dress and was in no mood to move on. The disagreement also touched deeper differences in etiquette and personal boundaries. Harry wrote in Spare about another awkward exchange in which Meghan referred to Catherine having baby brain after giving birth. According to his account, Catherine found the comment overly familiar and objected to the way she was spoken to. Again, the significance lies less in deciding who won the conversation than in noticing the cultural collision. In one social world, baby brain can be a casual, sympathetic phrase, the sort of thing a friend says while passing the biscuits. In another, especially between people who are not close, it can feel intrusive and patronizing. A phrase intended as informal warmth lands as disrespect. The follow-up conversation, meant to resolve the problem, becomes evidence that the relationship itself is unsafe. This is how family tensions deepen. People stop arguing about the original event and begin arguing about what the event reveals. It is no longer, "I disliked that comment." It becomes, "That comment shows you do not respect me." The answer is no longer, "I am sorry." It becomes, "Your reaction shows you never accepted me." Soon, everyone is debating character when they started with a sentence. Inside a royal household, even a private misunderstanding rarely remains between two people. There are private secretaries, press officers, assistants, protection teams, dressers, diary managers, and advisors. Information travels through formal channels because the work is complex. But a family cannot be run entirely like a government department, and a government department certainly should not attempt a family Christmas. When roles and relationships overlap, every personal disagreement has an administrative shadow. If two people prefer different working methods, staff may be caught between them. If one couple wants a faster response to a story, communications teams must decide whether it affects the others. If diaries conflict, a scheduling choice can be interpreted as status. If an employee leaves, anonymous speculation begins. By late 2018, reports of tension were multiplying. Stories described difficult behavior, staff turnover, tears, demands, and rivalry. Some claims were sourced anonymously and fiercely disputed. Some were later folded into broader allegations about the treatment of palace employees, which Meghan's representatives rejected. This film is not a courtroom, and anonymous palace reporting is not a verdict. What can be said with confidence is that the working arrangement was under strain. The two couples were not becoming the permanent joint operation imagined by the Fab Four brand. Harry and Meghan moved from Nottingham Cottage at Kensington Palace to Frogmore Cottage near Windsor. Royal households and offices began to separate. In June 2019, the Royal Foundation formally announced a new structure. William and Catherine would continue with the existing foundation, while Harry and Meghan would develop their own charitable plans. Organizationally, separation could be sensible. Different couples had different roles and priorities. Royal households have divided before without creating a national emergency. But by then, every administrative change was read as emotional evidence. A new office was not simply a new office. It was a custody agreement for the photocopier. The move to Windsor was not simply a move. It was proof, depending on which article you read, that Meghan had been exiled, that the couples could not stand one another, or that two adults expecting a baby preferred a larger home away from central London. Sometimes a house is a symbol. Sometimes it is a house. In royal coverage, it is usually both before breakfast. The public focused on Catherine and Meghan because the visual contrast was obvious, and because stories about female rivalry were easy to sell. But the deeper fracture was developing between William and Harry. Their relationship carried a lifetime of shared experience. They had walked behind their mother's coffin as boys while the world watched. They had lived through their parents' public conflict, the collapse of a marriage, and Diana's death. For years, the brothers were presented as each other's closest ally, two boys who understood what no one else could. But shared trauma does not guarantee shared adulthood. Sometimes it produces different survival strategies. William moved toward the institution. That was partly duty. His future role left little alternative. He built a family, accepted the gradual increase of responsibility, and learned to protect privacy through control. Harry increasingly defined himself through action, military service, the Invictus Games, and a desire to escape the parts of royal life that made him feel trapped. Both men had reason to distrust the press, but they appear to have developed different ideas about how to confront it. William's path was generally institutional: legal action when necessary, strategic cooperation, limited disclosure, and the long game. Harry's became more openly adversarial. He saw a tabloid system that had tormented his mother and in his view, was now targeting his wife. To him, restraint could look like surrender. This difference placed Catherine and Meghan in more than a personal disagreement. Each woman became associated with her husband's idea of safety. Catherine's safety was tied to boundaries, discretion, and the future stability of William's role. Meghan's safety was tied to being defended, believed, and allowed to speak. William may have seen Harry's public anger as a threat to the institution that his family would one day inherit. Harry saw the institution's caution as proof that it would sacrifice Meghan to preserve itself. Once that pattern took hold, almost any event could confirm it. If the palace remained silent about a negative story, Harry and Meghan could see abandonment. If Harry and Meghan challenged the story publicly, William and Catherine could see a breach of the family's collective discipline. Each side's method of self-protection became the other side's source of danger. Imagine two people in a small boat. One believes survival depends on staying perfectly still. The other believes survival depends on rowing as hard as possible. Even if both are trying to save everyone, they will experience the other person's movement as sabotage. There were also questions of pace and status. Harry had spent much of his life as the spare, the younger son whose popularity could be enormous while his constitutional importance declined with the birth of William's children. The title of his memoir would later make that tension explicit. For years, Harry's relative freedom had been an advantage. He could serve in the military, build Invictus, and connect with audiences in a looser style. But freedom can look different when the hierarchy begins to affect your spouse and child. What once felt like room to maneuver may begin to feel like proof that your branch of the family matters less. Meghan's arrival may not have created Harry's resentment. It may have given it a language and an urgency. At the same time, William's position was not simply privilege without pressure. He was preparing for a role he had not chosen and could not resign from without creating a constitutional crisis. Every family dispute now had a public consequence. A brother's unhappiness was also a risk to the future monarchy. That dual role, brother and heir, made ordinary intimacy nearly impossible. When William expressed concern, was he speaking as a brother or protecting the crown? When Harry objected, was he speaking as a husband or challenging the hierarchy? In reality, each man was probably doing both. This is why the popular framing of Kate versus Meghan is so incomplete. It takes a conflict rooted in brotherhood, succession, media power, race, institutional culture, personal pain, and incompatible definitions of loyalty, then reduces it to two women arguing beside a rack of children's clothing. The simplification is not harmless. It allows the men to become supporting characters in a conflict largely shaped by their own relationship. It turns structural problems into personality flaws. And it encourages strangers to speak about two women with a level of certainty normally reserved for people who are actually in the room. By 2019, the pressure around Harry and Meghan was intense. Their son, Archie, was born in May. The couple wanted greater privacy around the birth than royal tradition and media expectations usually allowed. Their decisions about when to announce labor, where to present the baby, and how much access to provide were treated not merely as personal choices, but as tests of their willingness to play the royal game. The phrase, royal game, sounds frivolous. The consequences did not feel frivolous to them. Harry had watched his mother pursued by cameras. He believed history was repeating itself around Meghan. In a deeply emotional statement released in October 2019, he connected the treatment of his wife with his fear of losing his mother. The couple also launched legal actions involving newspaper publishers. During a documentary filmed on their tour of Southern Africa, Meghan was asked how she was coping. She thanked the interviewer for asking, saying that not many people had asked whether she was okay. Harry confirmed that he and William were on different paths, while insisting that he loved his brother. Those moments changed the tone. The tension was no longer only the subject of anonymous briefings and body language analysis. Harry and Meghan were telling the public, in their own words, that they were struggling. For supporters, the honesty was overdue.
For critics, airing distress during an official tour seemed to shift attention away from the people and causes the tour was meant to highlight. Once again, the same action produced opposite interpretations: a necessary cry for help or a breach of professional duty. By the end of 2019, the question was no longer whether the Fab Four would work smoothly together. That dream had quietly been returned without a receipt. The question was whether Harry and Meghan could find any workable place inside the royal system at all. They spent an extended break in Canada. Then, on the 8th of January 2020, they announced that they intended to step back as senior members of the royal family, work toward financial independence, and divide their time between Britain and North America. The announcement landed like someone had opened a window during a state banquet. To Harry and Meghan, it was a proposal for a more sustainable life, continued service, but with distance, independence, and control. To the institution, it raised immediate questions about funding, security, commercial work, titles, representation, and whether anyone could be half inside a constitutional role. The monarchy is many things. Flexible about job descriptions is not traditionally one of them. Emergency discussions followed. Queen Elizabeth issued a notably personal statement, recognizing the intense scrutiny the couple had faced and supporting their wish for a more independent life. But the final arrangement was clearer and more complete than the hybrid model Harry and Meghan had first imagined. They would cease to be working members of the royal family. They would not use their HRH styles in practice. Public funding for royal duties would end. Harry would step back from honorary military appointments. In 2021, the palace confirmed that they would not return as working members. Officially, this was a change in duties. Emotionally, it was a rupture with the structure that had defined Harry's entire life. He was not simply leaving a job. Royal service had never been a job in the ordinary sense. There was no human resources portal where he could select pursuing other opportunities and return his ceremonial sword by Friday. The role was family, identity, history, country, and public expectation, tied into one very elaborate knot. For Meghan, leaving offered escape from a system in which she said she had felt isolated and unprotected. For Harry, it offered the chance to protect his wife and son in the way he believed the palace had failed to do. For William and Catherine, the departure meant more responsibility and a public storm around the institution they were committed to serving. It also meant that private disagreements could no longer be contained within one working family. The couples now lived in different countries, relied on different teams, and increasingly spoke through different narratives. The family argument had crossed the Atlantic. It would soon become a global broadcast. In March 2021, Harry and Meghan sat down with Oprah Winfrey for an interview watched around the world. It was the moment when years of rumor, hurt, and competing interpretation broke fully into public view. Meghan described loneliness and severe mental distress during her time as a working royal. She said she had sought help and felt it was not provided in the way she needed. She discussed the bridesmaid-dress story and said the reverse of the published version had happened. The couple also said there had been conversations about how dark their unborn child's skin might be, although they did not publicly identify the person involved. The palace later issued a brief statement, saying the issues raised, particularly that of race, were concerning and would be addressed privately, while noting that recollections could vary. That phrase, "recollections may vary," was only 3 words, but in palace language, it was practically a car chase. The interview transformed the dispute. Before it, much of the conflict had been narrated by reporters, commentators, and anonymous sources. Now Harry and Meghan had presented a detailed moral argument. They had not simply been unhappy. They believed the system had failed to protect them.
For many viewers, especially people who recognized experiences of racism, isolation, or mental health crisis, Meghan's account was powerful and credible. For others, the interview raised questions about context, accuracy, and the fairness of making serious claims in a format where relatives were unlikely to respond point by point. Both reactions reveal why reconciliation became harder after the broadcast. The conversation was no longer only about what happened. It was about who had the right to define what happened. Harry and Meghan believed public explanation was necessary because private channels had failed and harmful stories already filled the silence. The palace believed deeply personal matters should be handled privately, and that public rebuttal could damage the institution and family further. To one side, telling the story was self-defense.
To the other, telling the story was the breach. This conflict between silence and testimony sits at the heart of the entire royal rift. The monarchy has traditionally survived scandal through controlled continuity. A crisis arrives, the palace says little, engagements continue, time passes, the institution remains. The message is that the crown is larger than any individual grievance. Modern celebrity culture works in the opposite direction. Silence allows other people to own your narrative. If you do not explain yourself, someone with a podcast, a source, and a ring light will do it for you. Personal truth becomes a form of authority. Harry and Meghan chose testimony. William and Catherine chose continuity. After the Oprah interview, the 2 paths became increasingly distinct. The Sussexes built an independent organization and signed major media deals. Their public identity centered on charitable work, personal storytelling, and a critique of the forces they believed had driven them from royal life. William and Catherine continued official duties, prepared for greater responsibility, and largely avoided direct public engagement with the allegations. This difference created a strange imbalance. One side spoke in interviews, documentaries, podcasts, and a memoir. The other side mostly communicated through official appearances and carefully worded statements. The result was not one conversation, but 2 separate films projected onto the same screen. In one, Harry and Meghan were survivors of an outdated institution and a hostile press culture. In the other, William and Catherine were public servants, absorbing criticism without answering back, while the monarchy carried on. Social media turned these interpretations into rival kingdoms of their own. Supporters analyzed every headline, photograph, seating arrangement, birthday message, and facial expression. A glance became a snub. A silence became strategy. A shared walk became reconciliation. A delayed social media post became an act of war. If palace life is governed by protocol, online royal fandom is governed by screenshots with red circles. This environment made nuance difficult. To acknowledge that Meghan faced racist coverage was treated by some as proof that every criticism of her was racist. To acknowledge that the palace faced legitimate operational constraints was treated by others as proof that the institution had done nothing wrong. Public debate demanded saints and villains. Real life kept offering exhausted human beings with lawyers. The death of Prince Philip in April 2021 briefly brought Harry back to Britain. The funeral took place under pandemic restrictions, with the Queen sitting alone, a stark image of personal grief and public duty. Cameras followed William and Harry as they walked after the service, searching for signs of warmth or distance. That search would repeat after Queen Elizabeth II died in September 2022. In a surprising public appearance, William, Catherine, Harry, and Meghan walked together outside Windsor Castle to meet mourners and view tributes. For a moment, the Fab Four image returned, but now under the weight of grief and years of conflict. The pictures were immediately treated as evidence of a thaw. Perhaps, viewers hoped, loss had created perspective. Perhaps shared mourning could reopen a private door. But a public walk is not the same as private reconciliation. It can be an act of respect, discipline, or temporary unity. Families often stand together at funerals because the day belongs to the person who died, not because every wound among the living has healed. That distinction is crucial. Royal events are performances in the most serious sense of the word. People perform duty, ritual, and collective meaning. The performance may be sincere. It still does not tell us everything about the relationships behind it. In December 2022, the Netflix documentary series Harry and Meghan presented the couple's account of their relationship, media treatment, and departure. Then, in January 2023, Harry published Spare. The memoir moved the conflict into an even more intimate register. Harry described arguments with William, tensions involving Catherine and Meghan, frustration with Charles and Camilla, and the long, psychological shadow of Diana's death. According to Harry's account, one confrontation with William became physical. He also described private exchanges surrounding the wedding and the bridesmaid dresses. The book was not an independent investigation. It was a memoir, Harry's account, shaped by his memory, emotion, and purpose. That does not make it false. It means it should be understood for what it is, a participant telling the story from inside his own experience. The palace did not publicly litigate each private detail. There was no official sequel called Spare, the Footnotes. For Harry, the book appeared to serve several purposes. It was testimony, explanation, accusation, and an attempt to reclaim an identity from a system that had defined him by birth order. He wrote openly about grief, panic, military service, relationships, shame, anger, and love for Meghan. The emotional argument was that silence had protected the wrong people and damaged him. But disclosure carries its own cost. The more private detail Harry shared, the harder it became for relatives to trust that a future conversation would remain private. Even if his goal included reconciliation, the method created a new obstacle to it. This is the paradox. Harry argued that public truth was necessary because private trust had already broken down. His family could view the public truth-telling as the reason trust could not be restored. Once again, each side's attempted solution became the other side's proof of the problem. By the time King Charles was crowned in May 2023, the division had settled into the architecture of public life. Harry attended the coronation without Meghan and returned quickly to the United States. William, Catherine, and their children occupied central ceremonial roles. The images did not need commentary. One brother was part of the institution's future. The other was present as family, but visibly outside the working structure. And what of Catherine and Meghan themselves? The public often speaks as though they are engaged in a continuous personal duel, waking each morning to check what the other has worn, launched, or said. There is little reliable evidence for such a melodramatic picture. Their lives have largely separated. Their contact, if any, is private. Much of the feud now exists as a media framework attached to two women who rarely occupy the same physical space. That does not mean the hurt was imaginary. It means distance has replaced daily conflict. Catherine became Princess of Wales after Queen Elizabeth's death
and Charles's accession. Her role moved closer to the center of the monarchy. She and William became the most visible representatives of its next generation, carrying the burden of continuity through family change, public scrutiny, and serious health challenges. Meghan continued building a life in California with Harry and their children, Archie and Lilibet. Her public work developed outside palace control, where she could choose projects, partners, formats, and messages more freely. That freedom brought independence, but not escape from scrutiny. Every venture was still analyzed through the royal story she had left. The women came to symbolize two incompatible responses to the same institution. Catherine's response was adaptation. Learn the rules, build influence gradually, protect the family through discretion, and allow duty to speak over time. Meghan's response was self-definition. Refuse to disappear inside the role. Name harmful experiences, and leave when the cost becomes unacceptable. These are public symbols, not complete portraits. Catherine is not simply silent. Meghan is not simply rebellious. But symbols are powerful because they compress complexity into something an audience can recognize. The tragedy is that once a person becomes a symbol, their ordinary humanity is easy to forget. Catherine was expected to welcome Meghan perfectly while managing pregnancy, children, public duties, and the future of her own household. Meghan was expected to learn a centuries-old system at speed while facing family turmoil, hostile coverage, and the psychological shock of losing control over basic parts of her life. Both were expected to perform warmth for cameras, because apparently marrying princes also includes mandatory chemistry with your sister-in-law. Perhaps they liked one another at times. Perhaps they did not. Perhaps their relationship moved through friendliness, awkwardness, offense, apology, suspicion, and distance, like many family relationships do. The public evidence does not support the fairy tale of instant sisterhood or the cartoon of eternal enemies. What the evidence does support is a pattern of incompatible expectations. Meghan later said she had expected Catherine to understand the pressures of joining the family, but Catherine's own experience may have made that less likely, not more. She had survived by accepting the slow, restrained palace method. If she believed endurance was the path, Meghan's desire for a different path might have seemed destabilizing. Meghan, in turn, may have looked at Catherine's established position and assumed she had the power to intervene more directly. If Catherine did not, restraint could feel like rejection. The person who has adapted to a difficult system often sees adaptation as wisdom. The newcomer may see the same behavior as complicity. Neither interpretation requires either woman to be cruel. It requires only that they understand responsibility differently. There was another impossible expectation placed upon Catherine, that she should mediate between William and Harry. Because she had once appeared close to Harry, commentators imagined she might serve as peacemaker. But asking a wife to repair a conflict involving her husband, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, staff, and future constitutional role is not a small favor. It is several years of family therapy disguised as afternoon tea. Meghan faced the mirror image of that expectation. She was blamed by critics for changing Harry, as though an adult prince had no history, agency, or grievances before meeting her. This narrative was convenient because it turned a complicated royal conflict into a familiar story. The outsider arrives and corrupts the son. But Harry had publicly expressed pain about royal life and the press long before Meghan. His military career, grief, resentment of cameras, and position as the younger brother all shaped his choices. Meghan influenced him, as spouses influence one another. That is different from controlling him. Similarly, Catherine's loyalty to William does not mean she engineered the split. Partners usually support partners,
especially when a family conflict becomes threatening. That support can deepen divisions without being their original cause. The two couples formed protective units. Under pressure, those units tightened. Information became dangerous. Motives were questioned. Teams managed contact. And what might once have been resolved by 4 people in a room became a matter involving advisors, schedules, security, reputation, and the possibility of another global headline. At that point, reconciliation stopped being only an emotional choice. It became a risk assessment. Consider what a private conversation would require now. First, everyone would need to agree that the conversation would remain private. That sounds simple until privacy itself is one of the subjects in dispute. Harry and Meghan may fear that palace sources will brief the press. William and Catherine may fear that personal exchanges will later appear in an interview or book. Each side can point to past events as justification for mistrust. Second, they would need to agree on what an apology is for. Is it for failing to defend Meghan from harmful coverage? For speaking publicly about family matters? For doubting the relationship? For a comment, a dress, an argument, a briefing, a security decision, or years of accumulated suspicion? An apology works only when both people are discussing roughly the same injury. Otherwise, "I am sorry," is followed by the uniquely British disaster of, "What precisely are you sorry for?" And suddenly, someone is drawing a timeline on the back of a napkin. Third, they would need to separate personal reconciliation from institutional return. Harry can be a son and brother without becoming a working royal again. Meghan can have a relationship with relatives without accepting palace control. William can care about Harry without agreeing with his public choices. Catherine can wish a family well without becoming Meghan's close friend. This separation may be the only realistic path. The old Fab Four arrangement is gone. The couples live in different countries, serve different organizations, and operate under different assumptions. Reconciliation, if it ever comes, will not be a reboot of 2018 with better press officers. It would have to be smaller, quieter, and less photogenic. That may be why public signs tell us so little. A phone call can be polite without being intimate. A birthday message can be courteous without signaling a breakthrough. Attendance at a ceremony can express respect without restoring trust. The public wants one definitive moment because definitive moments make good television. Families usually heal, when they heal at all, through boring repetition. One conversation that does not leak. One boundary that is respected. One event that passes without commentary. One message answered without suspicion. No grand balcony scene. No orchestra. Possibly no hats. The media environment works against this kind of repair. Any contact becomes content. A meeting is a summit. A missed meeting is a snub. A 5-minute conversation becomes either a historic breakthrough or a fresh humiliation, depending on which headline tested better before lunch. The audience participates too. Royal conflict has become an identity product. Online communities are invested not only in the people, but in narratives about them. One side sees Meghan as a courageous outsider challenging a rigid and racially troubled institution. Another sees her as an ambitious celebrity who rejected duty while keeping its global prestige. One side sees Catherine as dignified under pressure. Another sees her as a symbol of an institution that protected itself through silence. These interpretations often say as much about our values as they do about the women. Do we admire endurance or escape? Privacy or disclosure? Tradition or self-invention? Do we believe loyalty means protecting the group from scandal or protecting the individual from the group? When does silence become dignity, and when does it become complicity?
When does speaking out become courage? And when does it become betrayal? The royal family turns these abstract questions into people wearing very expensive coats. That is one reason the story remains so compelling. The setting is extraordinary, but the emotional machinery is familiar. Many families have an older child who carries responsibility and a younger child who feels overlooked. Many families have a newcomer who challenges old habits.
Many have arguments in which the official subject is almost comically small, because the real subject is years of unspoken feeling. Most families simply do not have a communications office, a line of succession, and a correspondent standing outside the gate in the rain. The monarchy intensifies every dynamic. Birth order is not only psychological, it is constitutional. Family loyalty is not only personal, it protects a national institution. A wedding is not only a wedding, it is diplomacy, tourism, television, symbolism, and several thousand hours of discussion about lace. In that environment, even kindness becomes political. If the palace defends one person, will every royal expect the same? If one couple is allowed to combine official status with commercial freedom, what precedent does that create? If a future king speaks candidly to his brother, can he trust the conversation to remain a family matter? These questions do not excuse cruelty, neglect, racism, or indifference. Institutions are responsible for the human consequences of their rules. But they help explain why didn't they just talk, is not a complete solution. They may have talked many times. Talking is not magic. If people bring incompatible definitions of the problem, another conversation can deepen the wound. The bridesmaid story illustrates this perfectly. At first glance, it asks one question: who made whom cry? But underneath are several others. Who was under greater pressure? Whose memory is trusted? Who had more power? Who deserved public defense? What did Catherine owe Meghan? What did Meghan owe Catherine? Should the palace correct a private story? And what happens when an apology is accepted privately, but the public narrative remains unchanged? No wonder the dress became a symbol. It could hold every grievance, because it was too small to hold any of them properly. The Fab Four image worked the same way in reverse. It was large enough to hold every hope. It promised youth, unity, diversity, duty, warmth, modernity and tradition all at once. It asked 4 individuals to solve the monarchy's future by appearing together and smiling. When the image failed, people felt betrayed by a promise the 4 themselves may never have made. The press had packaged a family as a franchise. The audience expected sequels. Instead, William and Harry became representatives of 2 different roads. William's road led deeper into duty. His life became more tightly joined to the crown, especially after the death of his grandmother and the accession of his father. Whatever his private feelings, his public task demanded steadiness. The institution could not be treated as optional, because for him, it was the future. Harry's road led toward autonomy. He built a life outside the system, challenged the press in court, spoke about his past, and tried to define service without official royal status. Whatever the benefits of birth, he described the institution as a source of profound pain. Remaining inside no longer felt like duty. Leaving felt like survival. Catherine and Meghan came to embody those roads, sometimes unfairly. Catherine became continuity in a tailored coat. Meghan became refusal in California sunlight. But symbols can hide costs. Continuity asks a person to absorb emotion without public explanation. It rewards discipline, but can deny the relief of being understood. Refusal offers agency, but can make every new project part of the old argument.
Catherine cannot easily step outside the royal narrative. Meghan cannot easily escape it. Both women remain attached to a story written around them by institutions, husbands, media, supporters, critics, and strangers. So, did a feud between Kate and Meghan break the royal family? No. That version is too neat. There were real tensions between them, and those tensions mattered. A private disagreement can wound trust. A failure to feel welcomed or respected can shape a person's entire experience of a family. But the scale of the rupture cannot be explained by the personalities of two sisters-in-law. The family was carrying older fractures. William and Harry's different roles, the trauma of Diana's death, decades of conflict with the press, the demands of succession, and the monarchy's difficulty adapting its culture without weakening its authority. Meghan's arrival did not invent those pressures. It exposed them. Catherine did not single-handedly defend the old system. She had spent years learning how to live inside it. The conflict grew because every person acted from a position that made emotional sense to them. Catherine protected boundaries. Meghan protected identity. William protected continuity. Harry protected his wife and the life they wanted to build. Protection sounds noble, until four forms of protection collide. The saddest element may be that each side appears to have wanted something recognizably human: to feel safe, to be respected, to keep a family together, to preserve dignity, to have private pain acknowledged, to avoid repeating the disasters of the past. Yet fear can turn those desires into walls. The person seeking acknowledgement speaks louder. The person seeking privacy withdraws further. The louder one becomes, the more the quiet one distrusts them. The quieter one becomes, the more the other feels erased. Round and round it goes, like a royal carriage trapped on a roundabout, while the driver insists everything is proceeding exactly as planned. Time alone does not solve that pattern. Distance can lower the temperature, but it can also harden separate realities. New children are born, roles change, parents age, public events force brief reunions. Each side accumulates years in which life continued without the other. Reconciliation remains possible in the abstract because families surprise us. But genuine reconciliation would require something the public may never witness: an agreement that no one gets complete victory. Harry and Meghan may never receive every public correction or apology they believe is owed. William and Catherine may never recover the old assumption that family conversations stay within the family. The Sussexes are unlikely to return to the working arrangement they once imagined. The Waleses cannot offer equality of status inside a hereditary hierarchy. Peace may therefore look less like agreement and more like limits. We will not relive every argument. We will not brief against one another. We will respect the children's relationships. We will meet without demanding a photograph. We will accept that closeness cannot be commanded by title, blood, or public opinion. That is not the fairy tale ending. It may be the adult one. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the royal rift. For years, the world asked whether Catherine and Meghan could become sisters. It was the wrong question. Sisterhood cannot be assigned by a palace press release. Friendship cannot be manufactured by matching diary dates. Two women can love two brothers without becoming mirrors of each other. The better question is whether a family and an institution can make room for difference without turning it into disloyalty. So far, the answer has not been encouraging. An ancient monarchy met a modern demand for voice, identity, and accountability. A younger son rejected the role written for him. An older son held more tightly to the future written for him. Their wives became symbols in a battle whose deepest roots existed long before one American actress walked through the palace gates.
The result was not one villain and one victim, one cold duchess and one difficult duchess, one dress and one tear. It was a chain of human decisions inside a system that turns human decisions into history. Perhaps Catherine and Meghan were never meant to become best friends. There is nothing tragic in that. The tragedy is that ordinary incompatibility became public mythology, that two brothers came to represent opposing worlds, and that a family disagreement grew into a divide so deep that every gesture across it now becomes news. Once, 4 people stood together and were asked to embody the future of the monarchy. The public saw unity. The cameras saw a perfect frame. What no photograph could show was how differently those 4 people understood loyalty, duty, freedom, and protection. That difference, not a dress, not a single comment, not one woman's personality, is the real story. And until the people involved can trust silence without feeling erased, and trust conversation without fearing exposure, the royal rift will remain what it has become. Not a war between 2 women, but a family wound displayed beneath a crown.